Hey guys, tonight we're going to explore why you can't just pop back in time and be a medieval slave for a day. Yeah, I know it sounds like a wild idea, maybe even a bit tempting, if you're into historical reenactments or just curious about the past. But trust me, this isn't like trying on a costume at a Renaissance fair. You're about to step into a world where freedom is a distant dream and survival is a daily grind. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and local time. It's always cool to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up in a cold, damp hut, the smell of straw and sweat filling your nostrils. Your body aches from yesterday's labor, and you know today will be no different. You're not just tired, you're bone weary, the kind of exhaustion that seeps into your soul. Welcome to the life of a medieval slave. But what exactly was medieval slavery? It wasn't a monolithic institution. It varied across time and place. In some regions, you might have been captured in war, dragged from your village in chains after a raid by Viking marauders or rival lords. In others, you were sold into bondage to pay off a debt. Maybe your family couldn't cover the rent, and you were the collateral. Or perhaps you were born into it, your status inherited like a family curse passed down because your parents couldn't break the cycle. Unlike the chattel slavery of later centuries, medieval slaves sometimes had a few legal protections. Perhaps you could own a small plot of land or save up to buy your freedom. But don't get your hopes up. These rights were fragile, easily revoked by a master who woke up on the wrong side of the bed. Economically, you were indispensable. Whether you were toiling in the fields, mining ore in dark, suffocating tunnels, or serving in a noble's household, your labor fueled the medieval economy. In medieval England, for instance, slaves made up about 10% of the population. 1 in every 10 people lived in bondage. Picture that you're walking through a bustling village, and every 10th person you pass is someone whose life isn't their own. And to ensure everyone knew your place, you might have had to wear distinctive clothing or even a mark on your body. Imagine a big S branded on your forehead. Now that's a fashion statement nobody asked for. But medieval slavery wasn't just a historical curiosity. It was a system that shaped societies for centuries. The justifications for owning other side is, like might makes right, or they're better off under our care didn't vanish with the Middle Ages. They evolved, adapted, and in some cases lingered into the modern era. The laws that reduced human beings to property set a precedent, a grim blueprint for later forms of exploitation. Understanding medieval slavery helps us trace the roots of inequality and the long, arduous journey toward human rights, a journey that's still not over, if we're being honest. Historians still debate why slavery declined in medieval Europe. Was it the rise of serfdom, which tied workers to the land in a slightly less brutal way, offering landowners a more stable labor force? Or did the church's teachings on human dignity begin to take hold, slowly chipping away at the institution with sermons about compassion and redemption? The answer likely lies somewhere in between a messy tangle of economic pragmatism and moral awakening. But as you're lying there on your lumpy straw pallet, these debates are the last thing on your mind. Your reality is the daily grind, the constant struggle to survive in a world that sees you as less than human. You don't get weekends off or vacation days, no medieval equivalent of a spa retreat for you. Every day is a work day, and slacking off isn't an option unless you fancy whipping a stint in the stocks or worse. But hey, at least you don't have to worry about your boss sending you emails at midnight. Your overseer prefers to yell in person. Life as a medieval slave varied depending on where and when you lived. If you were a field hand on a sprawling manor, your days were an endless cycle of backbreaking labor, plowing muddy fields with a wooden plow that feels like it weighs as much as you do, sowing seeds in the biting wind or harvesting wheat under a sun that seems to hate you personally. During harvest season, you're out there from dawn till dusk, scything stalks until your hands are blistered and raw, the overseer's whip cracking like thunder if you slow down. The air smells of earth and desperation, and by nightfall, you collapse onto your straw mat too tired to even dream. But not all slaves worked the land. Some were domestic servants in the lords, household scrubbing flagstone floors until your knuckles bleed, hauling water from the well, or tending to spoiled noble children who think you're furniture. These indoor slaves might have had a roof over their heads and slightly better scraps to eat, but they were still at the mercy of their master's moods. Spill a goblet of wine or burn the stew, and you're dodging a slape or a trip to the dungeon if they're feeling dramatic. Then there were the skilled slaves. Maybe you're a blacksmith, hammering glowing iron, a carpenter shaping timber, or a weaver threading a loom with calloused fingers. Your talents were valuable, and your master knew it. You might even earn a few coins on the side, but don't be fooled. Those coins were a tease, a carrot dangled just out of reach. Freedom was still a long shot, and every hammer strike or stitch was for someone else's profit. Within the slave community, there were hierarchies too. Older slaves, or those with specialized roles, might command a certain respect, a quiet nod as you pass them in the yard. But respect doesn't change the fact that you're all bound by the same invisible chains, the same grinding reality of servitude. Escape. That's a gamble few win. Running away means dodging patrols, surviving on stolen scraps, and praying you don't get caught. If you're nabbed, the punishment is brutal, branding with a hot iron, a severed ear, or a noose if your master's feeling Old Testament about it. Even if you make it, where do you go? In a tight-knit medieval world, a stranger with no papers or kin stands out like a sore thumb. You're a ghost with nowhere to haunt. There was one faint flicker of hope, manumission. In some places, a Kindor calculating master might free you maybe as a reward for decades of loyal service or because you scraped together enough to buy yourself. In parts of medieval Europe, you could petition a court, or a priest might intervene if you got lucky. But manumission was rare, a golden ticket most never touched. Even if you won it, freedom came with baggage debts to pay obligations to your former owner, or a society that still saw you as lesser. For most slaves, freedom stayed a whisper in the dark, a story swapped over a flickering fire after another soul-crushing day. You might hear tales of someone who made it a friend of a friend who slipped the yoke. But those stories are as much myth as reality, keeping you going when the weight of it all threatens to break you. So medieval slavery wasn't just a job or a phase you could dip into like a historical VR game. It was a life sentence, a system built to grind you down body and spirit until you were nothing but a shadow of what you could have been. That's why you can't just try it for a day. The exhaustion, the fear, the utter lack of control would hit you like a brick wall, and there's no pause button to make it stop. But here's the kicker. This isn't just some dusty old tale to yawn through. Medieval slavery matters because it's a mirror reflecting how humans have wrestled with power, greed, and compassion for millennia. It's not a footnote, it's a foundation one that props up the world we live in today, warts and all. So, as you snuggle into your cozy bed, safe from the whip and the cold, think about that. The past isn't gone. It's just waiting for us to listen. We're not done yet. In the next section, we'll walk through a day in the life of a medieval slave sun-up to sundown, no sugarcoating. So stick around and let's keep this journey going. History's not always pretty, but it's always worth the dive. The night doesn't last long enough. Before you know it, the roosters are at it again, dragging you out of a dreamless sleep. Your body feels like it's been trampled by the oxen you spent yesterday plowing with, but there's no time to wallow in it. You roll off the straw, the damp chill of the hut seeping into your bones, and start the whole miserable routine over again. Same tunic, same bucket of icy water, same muddy path to the fields. It's like someone hit the repeat button on your life, and there's no skipping the track. This morning, though, there's a twist. As you stumble into the courtyard for your gruel, you notice a small crowd of slaves huddled near the cook's fire. You shuffle closer, curious despite your exhaustion. One of them, a wiry guy named Edric, with a scar across his cheek, is muttering under his breath. "They're bringing in more hands today," he says, spooning gruel into his mouth. "Heard the master's got a big harvest coming, and we're behind." You nod, not sure if that's good or bad news. More hands could mean less work for you, or it could mean the overseer riding everyone harder to impress the master. Either way, you're not holding your breath for a lighter load. The sun's barely up when you're back in the fields this time, with a sickle in hand. The wheat's ripe golden heads swaying in the breeze, and it's your job to cut it down. You bend low, swinging the blade in steady arcs, the dry stalks crunching under your feet. The sound's almost satisfying, like the world's giving you something back for once. But the ache in your back kills any joy in it. Sweat stings your eyes, and the dust sticks to your skin, turning you into a walking dirt clod. You glance up now, and then watching the new slaves trickle in. They're a ragged bunch, eyes wide with fear or dulled by resignation. You wonder where they came from, raided villages, debts they couldn't pay, or just bad luck. Doesn't matter. They're here now, same as you. The overseer's voice cuts through the air like a whip crack. "Move it, you lot. The master's coming to check the progress." Your stomach twists. The master doesn't show up often, but when he does, it's never good. You pick up the pace, your arms burning with each swing of the sickle. The newbies fumble with their tools, earning shouts and shoves from the overseer. You keep your head down, focusing on the wheat, trying to blend into the rhythm of the work. Last thing you need is the master's eye on you. By midday, the heat's unbearable. The sun's a relentless fist pounding down, and there's no shade to hide in. Your throat's so dry, it feels like you've swallowed sand, but water's scarce today. The bucket's already half empty, and the overseer's guarding it like it's gold. You sneak a glance at Edric, who's working a few rows over. He catches your eye and smirks, wiping sweat from his brow. "Bet you a crust of bread. We'll be here past sundown," he whispers. You snort despite yourself. "I'd take that bet if I had bread to spare." It's the closest thing to a laugh you've had in weeks. Then you hear it hooves, thudding against the earth. The master's here. You straighten up just enough to look busy and steal a peek. Hez, a tall man, broad-shouldered, draped in a fine cloak that probably costs more than your life. He's riding a horse so glossy it looks like it's never seen a speck of mud. Beside him is the overseer, pointing at the fields, nodding like a dog begging for a treat. The master's eyes sweep over the scene, cold and sharp, like his counting coins instead of people. You turn back to the wheat heart pounding. You've seen what happens when he's displeased. Last time a slave got flogged for dropping a sack of grain. You're not about to be next. The rest of the day drags on heavier now with the master's presence hanging over you. The sickle feels like lead the wheat endless. Your hands are blistered. Your back's a knot of pain, and every step feels like wading through mud. The new slaves are struggling, own of them. A kid barely old enough to shave keeps stopping to catch his breath. The overseer's on him in a flash barking orders, but the kid just looks lost. You feel a pang of something pity maybe, but you shove it down. Can't afford to care too much out here. As the sky bleeds red with sunset, the master finally rides off, leaving the overseer to herd you all back to the manor. You're swaying on your feet, dizzy with hunger and fatigue when Edric sidles up. Told you past sundown, he says, grinning faintly. You roll your eyes, too tired to argue. Supper's the same gruel cold now, but you scarf it down anyway. Then it's back to the hut, the straw bed calling your name. You collapse, the world fading fast, but one thought lingers: tomorrow's another day of this. And the next day, and the next. Unless something changes. You're not sure what that looked like. Freedom's just a word you've heard in whispers. But as sleep takes you, you can't help wondering if there's more to this life than surviving. Maybe tomorrow will tell. You're not just tired, you're trapped. This isn't some fleeting frustration you can shrug off. It's real, raw, and relentless. Chains rattle when you move too fast. Whips crack if you slow down. And a master looms over you, owning you like you're no more than a plow or a pig. Freedom, you've heard the word hissed around the fire at night, but it's as unreachable as the moon. You don't decide when you wake what you eat or who you speak to. Every step, every breath belongs to someone else, and that truth presses down on you like a millstone. Take today as an example. You're out in the fields again, the same endless grind. But up at the manor, there's a wedding. The master's daughter is marrying some noble from across the river, and the air's thick with celebration lauder music, the scent of roasted meat and mulled wine drifting down the hill. You're slogging through mud, hauling grain sacks to the storehouse, the weight biting into your shoulder. The overseer's watching hawk-eyed, ready to snap. Eyes down thrall, he growls, spitting out that old word for slave. You clench your jaw and trudge on the sack, rubbing your skin raw. It's not that you're itching to dance at the feast, though a crust of bread and a moment's rest would be heaven. But the difference cuts deep. Up there, they're toasting to beginnings, to futures. Down here, you're just praying your legs hold out till dusk. And even if you could slip away, where would you go? The manor's lands sprawl for miles. Beyond that, it's wild forest or another lord's domain where you'd be caught and returned, or worse. You're not a man. You're a thing, and things don't run your minds. Not even your own, not really. The church insists you've got a soul, but that's a thin thread to cling to when your body's someone else's tool. The priest drones on Sundays about obedience, how your misery now buys you paradise later. Trudging through the muck, though that afterlife promise feels like a cruel jest. You'd swap every sermon for one day, just one, where you could lie in the grass, watch the sky, and not feel the overseer's shadow. Then there's family, or what passes for it. There's Alf Gifu from the hut next to yours. You've stolen moments with her when the overseer's distracted. Not love like the songs, maybe, but a quiet comfort. Slaves can't marry, of course, but you've got a son together. A wiry little thing, with her sharp eyes and your hard head. Only he's not yours, not truly. The master owns him just like he owns you. Any day, he could be sold off, carted to another estate, and you'd be powerless. That fear gnaws at you, but you swallow it. No point in chewing on what you can't change. The rules thought, hair a cage you can't see, but always feel. You can't leave the manor, not without a permission that never comes. You can't own a thing not the threadbare tunic you wear handed down from the master's discard pile. You can't say no, no matter how brutal the order. Break a rule, and it's a flogging for mouthing off stocks, for snatching a bite, or a one-way trip to the salt mines where slaves burn out fast. It's the small rules that wear you down most. Bow your head when the master's kin pass, even if they don't notice. Eat in silence, no laughing, no talking. No singing in the fields, unless it's the overseer's dreary chants. It's like they're wringing every speck of life out of you, leaving just the ache in your bones and the void in your chest. Still, you fight back in ways too small to hang you for. A quick grin with Alf Gifu when no one's looking. A tune hummed so soft, only you hear it. Stories whispered to your son at night, tales of warriors and distant seas, spun from nothing but your own head, since you've never left these walls. These are your rebellions, fragile as they are proof you're still a person, still clinging to something like hope. Hope's a tricky beast, though. Some nights, on your straw mat, you dream of breaking free, running through the woods. No chains, just wind and sky. Other nights, the dream sours, you're snared, dragged back the whips, sting waking you in a cold sweat. Reality crashes and escapes a long shot, and even if you dared, the world's rigged against you. So you endure. Head down, hands busy surviving. Freedom's not an option. It's a fairy tale you tell yourself to face the dawn. As you drift off the weddings, distant cheer fading, you wonder if you'll ever know a life that's yours. Doubtful. For now, sleep's the only taste of freedom you've got, and you'll take it. Imagine waking up to a body that already hates you. The sun's not even up, but you're jolted awake by the overseers bellow your muscles, stiff and throbbing from yesterday's work. Your bed, a pitiful scattering of straw over cold, hard, dirtless, a mattress more a torture device. All night the prickly stalks jabbed into your back, leaving red welts that itch like mad. The air in the hut is damp and icy, seeping through the thin, ragged tunic that's your only shield against the elements. You try to stand, but your joints groan in protest, locked tight from hours of stillness. Every movement feels like dragging a millstone, and you're not sure where the soreness stops, and you begin. It's all just one big aching blur. There's no time to shake it off, though. The overseer's voice cuts through the dawn, sharp and merciless, driving you out into the frost-bitten morning. Your breath puffs out in little clouds, a cruel reminder that winter's on its way, ready to sink its teeth in deeper. Last year, it claimed live, huddled bodies, too frail to survive the chillin' you're dreading its return. You shove the thought aside and shuffle forward, the mud squelching under your bare feet, cold and slick enough to make you stumble. Today's work isn't just plowing fields, though that's brutal enough. No, the overseer's got a whole menu of misery lined up. First, you're hauling stones from the quarry to build the master's new wall. Each rock is a monster jagged, heavy, and unforgiving. You grip one, its edges biting into your palms, and hoist it onto your shoulder. The weight slams down, pressing your spine into a curve it wasn't meant to hold. Your legs tremble as you trudge forward, the mile-long trek stretching into eternity. By the fourth trip, your shoulders are screaming, your hands raw, and bleeding from fresh blisters. Sweat stings your eyes, but you can't stop to wipe it away, not with the overseer lurking his whip, coiled like a snake ready to strike. The sun climbs higher, turning the air into a furnace. Your tunics soak through, clinging to your skin like a parasite, while flies swarm around you, drawn to the reek of sweat and open sores. They buzz and bite, leaving welts that itch and burn, but swatting them is a waste of energy you don't have. Dehydrations, setting in your mouths dry, as dust, your head pounding, but the only water's a murky trickle half a mile off, and you're not allowed to fetch it yet. You're burning up, but there's no shade, no mercy, just the relentless glare baking you alive. Hunger gnaws at you too. Breakfast was a joka, crust of bread, so stale it could break teeth, and a watery gruel that tastes like despair. It's barely enough to quiet your stomach's growls, let alone power the labor they demand. You can feel your ribs jutting out your arms, thinning as your body eats itself to keep going. They don't care if you're strong. They just need you functional, a machine that doesn't get to break down. Next up, chopping wood. You grab the axe, its handle slick with the sweat of 100 hands before yours, and start swinging. Every strike jars your arms, sending shock waves through your bones. The woods, old and stubborn, splitting only after a dozen blows, and splinters fly like shrapnel lodging in your skin. One buries itself deep in your thumb, and you grit your teeth, yanking it out with a hiss. Blood drips, but you keep going. There's a quota, and falling short means a night tied to a post, exposed to the wind and the wolves. You've seen it happen, heard the whimpers of those too weak to fight back. The day blurs into a haze of torment. You mend fences, the thorns tearing at your fingers. You herd pigs, their mud-caked bodies slamming into your shins. You scrub floors until your knees are bruised and raw. Each task is a new wound, a fresh layer of exhaustion. Your muscles quiver, threatening to give out, and your vision swims hunger, heat, and fatigue, all conspiring to drag you down. But you can't stop. Stopping's not an option when the overseer's shadow looms, his presence a constant threat. Then there's the sickness. It's everywhere, festering in the damp, crowded huts. You hear it at night-racking coughs, fevered moans, and smell it in the air, a mix of sweat and rot. A cut on your leg from a rusty tool's gone red, and hot pus seeping out when you press it. You know it's bad, but there's no rest. No medicine, just whispered remedies from the others, like smearing it with mud and hoping for the best. You've seen slaves die from less, their bodies carted off like refuse, and you wonder how long you've got before you're next. The mental toll is a beast of its own. Pains your shadow, a dull roar that never shuts up. You mutter to yourself, curses, prayers, nonsense, just to keep from cracking. Sometimes you laugh, a hollow, jagged sound, because the alternative is sobbing, and you can't afford that. Exhaustion fogs your mind. Yesterday, you stared at a hoe for a full minute, unsure what it was for, until a shove from the overseer snapped you back. Mistakes like that earn punishment, and punishment's a nightmare you can't outrun. Yet there's a flicker of something human in the wreckage. Aelfric, the wiry slave beside you, presses a rag into your hand to staunch the blood. Your daughter, barely 5, slips you a wilted flower she found in the field, her eyes bright despite the filth. You cling to these scrap-steady rebellions against the void, knowing they're all that's keeping you from dissolving into the grind. The overseers, the final twist of the knife, has always there, eyes like a hawk, whip like a thunderclap. One slip a spilled bucket, a slow step, and he's on you. Last week, he flogged a boy for dropping a load of grain, the cracks echoing as the rest of you watch stomachs churning with dread. You're next if you falter, and that fear drives you harder than any lash. When the sun finally dips, you stagger back to the hut, a walking corpse. Your body's a ruin, muscle-shredded skin, torn bones aching so deep you feel it in your soul. You collapse onto the straw, too tired to eat the slop they've left, and sleep swallows you fast. It's not rest. It's oblivion, a black pit that spits you out at dawn to do it all again. That's slavery, a machine that chews you up day after day until there's nothing left to give. And yet, you keep going, one broken, defiant step at a time. You wake up at dawn, not because you choose to, but because the overseer's whip cracks if you're not in the fields by sunrise. Your breakfast is whatever scraps remain from the master's table, if you're fortunate enough to get anything at all. Then it's off to work, whether that means plowing fields, tending livestock, or hauling water. You have no say in the matter. Your master dictates every aspect of your day. As you trudge through the mud, your mind drifts to dreams of freedom, but those fleeting thoughts are swiftly crushed by the harsh reality of your existence. You're not permitted to leave the estate without permission, and if you dare to run, the consequences are brutal. You've heard tales of slaves recaptured and returned their backs scarred from the lash or worse. The emotional toll of this life is overwhelming. You live in a constant state of fear, fear of the overseers, whip fear of your master's unpredictable temper, fear that your children could be torn from you and sold. A deep, unshakable hopelessness seeps into your bones, knowing that this is your life with no end in sight. You feel worthless, reduced to less than a person, because that's how you're treated, mere property, in the eyes of those who own you. In the slave quarters, you find a fragile sliver of solace. Here you can speak freely, share stories, and offer what little comfort you can to one another. Yet even in this sanctuary, divisions persist. The house slaves who serve in the master's home often look down on the field hands clinging to their slightly better clothing and food as a badge of superiority. It's a trivial difference, but in a world where you have so little, even the smallest edge feels like a lifeline. Your master remains an enigma. On some days, he might toss you an extra scrap of bread or grant a brief moment of rest, his actions almost resembling kindness. On others, his rage erupts without warning, and you become the target whether you've erred or not. You live in perpetual dread of his moods, never knowing what might ignite his fury. At night, you gather with the others to pray. The priest's words weave a faint thread of hope, a promise that one day you'll find freedom in the eyes of God, even if the world of men denies it to you. It's a meager comfort, but in the darkness, it's something to cling to. Over time, the relentless degradation erodes your sense of self. The absence of control, the ceaseless humiliation, all seeps into your soul. You begin to believe the lie beaten into you day after day, that this is the life you deserve, that you're unworthy of anything more. Yet even amidst this despair, a spark of defiance flickers. You might steal a moment to rest when the overseer's back is turned, or exchange a fleeting secret smile with a fellow slave. These small rebellions whisper a quiet truth: I am still here. I am still human. And so, you endure day after day, wrestling with the crushing psychological weight of being owned fully aware that your life is not your own. But buried deep within a faint glimmer of hope persists a fragile belief that perhaps things could one day be different. Imagine waking before dawn, the chill of the night still clinging to your bones. Your bed is a thin layer of straw damp from the earth beneath, and the air is thick with the stench of sweat and despair. You share this cramped, dark hut with others like you slaves, the lowest rung of medieval society. There's no time to rest. The overseer's whip will crack soon, and you must rise pulling on a tattered tunic that's been your only garment for months. You stumble into the gray morning facing endless fields of wheat and barley that you'll tend until nightfall. Your body aches. Your stomach growls, but there's no reprieve. This is your life, unchanging and relentless because you are a slave. The medieval pyramid. In medieval Europe, society was a rigid hierarchy, a towering pyramid of power and privilege. At its peak sat the king, a figure of divine authority, his word law across the land. Below him were the nobles, cloaked in silks and furs, their grand castles bustling with servants who catered to their every whim. They dined on roasted meats and sipped fine wines, their lives a stark contrast to yours. Next came the knights, celebrated warriors, whose valor was immortalized in song. The clergy followed, wielding the might of the church, their sermons shaping the souls of the realm. Merchants and craftsmen, though not of noble birth, held sway with their wealth, and trade their bustling markets, the heartbeat of towns. Even peasants tied to the land, as serfs had more than you they could marry, tend a small plot and pass down a humble legacy. But you, the slave, are the base of this pyramid crushed beneath the weight of all above. You own nothing, not even yourself. Your master can buy, sell, or punish you at will. You are less than a peasant, less than livestock, for even the oxen are prized for their strength. Your worth lies solely in the labor you provide, a silent cog in the medieval machine. A life in chains. Slavery varied across medieval Europe, shifting with time and place, but its essence was universal. Slaves were the bottom tier stripped of humanity. In early medieval England, slaves might have comprised 10% of the population, often war captives or thralls seized in Viking raids. Some were born into bondage, inheriting their parents' fate, while others fell into slavery through debt or crime. Your days are a blur of toil plowing fields, mining ore, or serving in a master's home. You eat stale bread and thin gruel, a meager fuel for endless work. Sleep is a brief escape, interrupted by the dawn's call to labor anew. Contrast this with the nobles who lounge in luxury, their every need met by others. Knights ride into battle for glory, their armor gleaming. Clergy pray in grand cathedrals, their influence vast. Merchants count their coins, and peasants, though poor, have a semblance of autonomy. You, however, have no rights, no voice, no hope, justifications, and beliefs. How was this accepted? The church played a dual role. It preached equality before God, yet endorsed slavery as a natural order, a punishment for sin. Biblical passages urged slaves to obey, and many clergy owned slaves themselves. Some saw it as a necessary evil, others a path to redemption in the afterlife. But for you toiling in the dirt, these were hollow words. Nobles, meanwhile, viewed you with contempt, their superiority a birthright. They believed you were meant to serve your inferiority innate. The law backed them, granting masters unchecked power beatings, brandings, even death, all with little consequence. The economic backbone. Yet for all their scorn, society depended on you. The medieval economy rested on slave and serf labor. You tilled the fields that fed the kingdom, mined the metals for swords, and built the castles that towered above. Without you, the system would falter. But this reliance was never admitted. Instead, you were kept ignorant and broken, denied education or opportunity. The fear of rebellion loomed large. If slaves united, the hierarchy might tremble. So exhaustion and isolation were your chains, rebellion, a fleeting dream. Glimmers of humanity. There were rare cracks in this order. Festivals might bring a day of rest, a fleeting taste of freedom. In some places, you could earn coins, or rarer still buy your liberty, though the odds were steep. In war or famine, the lines between slave and free blurred briefly. Within your own ranks, a grim hierarchy emerged. House slaves clad in slightly better rags looked down on field slaves, who in turn mocked their softness. These petty divides kept you splintered, unable to rise together. Your master was an enigma cruel, one day lenient the next, but always absolute. Some fed their slaves, decently knowing a strong worker lasted longer. Others ruled by fear, the whip their voice. You lived in uncertainty, never knowing what each day held. Resistance and resilience. At night by a meager fire, you found solace with your fellows. Here you shared whispers of escape to forests or mountains, but the risks were dire. Manumission freedom granted by a master was a faint hope reserved for the exceptional or the ancient. Most found release only in death, a life of labor and neglect cutting yours short. Disease and injury claimed many your graves, unmarked your passing unnoticed. Yet you resisted in small ways. A slower pace, when unwatched, a stolen rest in the shade, a shared crust of bread. These were your rebellions, proof your spirit endured. In the dark, you dreamed of distant lands where slavery was unknown, fragile hopes against a crushing reality. A stain on history. Slavery was medieval society's dark foundation. It propped up the hierarchy, yet denied its bearers dignity. You were human, as capable of love and dreams as any noble, but treated as property. The system thrived on your suffering, a testament to its injustice. As you lie on your straw mat, staring into the void, you wonder if change. Imagine waking up in the dim light of a medieval dawn, the chill of the morning seeping through the cracks of a rough wooden hut. You're a slave, one of countless men and women whose lives are defined by labor. Your day begins with the clatter of chains or the bark of an overseer urging you toward the fields or the mines. There's no pay, no rest, no choice, only the endless rhythm of work that stretches from sunrise to sunset. Your existence, though invisible to the nobles who profit from it, is the foundation of the medieval economy. Slavery isn't just a cruel footnote in history. It's the engine that drives agriculture industry and wealth in this era. Slavery was deeply woven into the fabric of medieval life, a system that provided a steady supply of cheap labor to fuel economic growth. From the sprawling fields of Europe to the bustling workshops of growing towns, slaves were the unseen hands behind the production of food goods and infrastructure. Their toil supported not only individual landowners, but entire communities, shaping the economic landscape of the time. In this section, we'll explore how slavery powered agriculture and industries, the benefits it brought to those in power, and its broader impact on the medieval economy. Slavery in agriculture, feeding the realm. In medieval Europe, agriculture was the heartbeat of survival and prosperity, and slaves were its lifeblood. Picture yourself in the fields, your hands gripping a plow as you carve furrows into the damp earth. The sun beats down, Or perhaps the rain soaks through your thin tunic, but you keep moving, planting seeds, weeding rows, harvesting grain. These tasks, grueling and relentless, are the backbone of food production. Slaves like you work on vast estates owned by nobles, or the church turning wilderness into farmland and ensuring a steady supply of crops like wheat, barley, and oats. Unlike serfs, who are bound to the land but have some rights, you are property bought and sold like livestock. This status makes you expendable a tool to maximize output. Your labor transforms small plots into sprawling fields, producing surpluses that feed not just the estate, but also the towns and cities beyond. These surpluses are traded at markets, shipped to distant regions, or stored for lean times, turning agricultural bounty into economic power. Without slaves, the scale of medieval farming would shrink and the growth of urban centers would stall. Your role extends beyond crops. You tend to sheep, cows, and pigs, shearing wool, milking, and butchering as needed. The wool you harvest becomes thread and fabric. The hides become leather goods that drive trade and industry. Yet while your hands create these riches, you wear only rags, your feet bare against the cold ground. The irony is bitter, but inescapable. Your suffering sustains the medieval world. Slavery in industries, building and crafting. Beyond the fields, slavery fueled a range of industries that shaped medieval society. Imagine being sent to a mine, the air thick with dust, as you swing a pickaxe against unyielding rock. Slaves extract gold, silver, iron, and salt resources that mint coins, arm knights, and season food. The work is perilous. A collapsing tunnel could end your life in an instant. But the wealth you unearth flows into the hands of kings and merchants, strengthening the economy with every strike of your tool. In construction, you're the muscle behind the medieval skyline. You drag massive stones to build cathedrals that pierce the heavens, castles that dominate the landscape, and bridges that span rivers. Each block you lift is a monument to your endurance, though you'll never step inside those grand halls as anything but a servant. The roads you pave link villages to markets, speeding the flow of goods and ideas. These projects, ambitious and enduring, rely on your labor to turn vision into reality. Workshops, too, hum with the efforts of slaves. You might sit at a loom weaving cloth from the wool you sheared or shape clay into pots for sale. These goods textiles, pottery tools fill market stalls and homes, driving local economies. The skills you develop are forced, not chosen, and the profits go to your master. Yet your work connects rural estates to urban centers, knitting together a web of commerce that sustains medieval life. Economic benefits, profit, and power. For those who own slaves, the economic advantages are immense. Your master pays nothing for your labor, just the bare minimum to keep you alive. A bowl of thin gruel, a corner of a shed to sleep in, that's your reward for a day's toil. Meanwhile, the crops you grow, the metals you mine, and the goods you craft swell his coffers. He can sell surplus grain at a profit, trade wool for luxury goods, or fund a new manor with the proceeds. Slavery is a business model that turns human lives into gold. The benefits ripple outward. The abundance you create supports a growing population, freeing others to become artisans, merchants, or soldiers. Towns expand as food and materials flow in, and trade networks stretch across continents. Even the church, a major landowner, relies on slaves to maintain its wealth, building monasteries and cathedrals with the fruits of your labor. Slavery isn't just a personal boon. For the elite, it's a pillar of the medieval economy, enabling progress at the cost of your freedom. The broader impact, growth and fragility. Slavery's role in the medieval economy was transformative but double-edged. Your work drove expansion more land, tilled more goods, produced more wealth accumulated. This growth fueled the rise of towns, the spread of trade, and the power of kingdoms. Yet it also bred dependence. If you and your fellow slaves were to falter through rebellion, disease, or sheer exhaustion, the system would tremble. The economy rested on a foundation of coercion, held together by fear and force. This reliance had long-term consequences. While slavery spurred short-term gains, it stifled innovation. Why invest in tools or techniques when human labor is free? And as the population grew, the tension between slaves and masters simmered, threatening stability. The medieval economy thrived on your suffering, but that suffering sowed seeds of fragility that would one day sprout. Linking to social structures. The economic power of slavery didn't exist in isolation. It shaped the very structure of medieval society. You, the slave, stand at the bottom of a rigid hierarchy, your labor propping up everyone above. Serfs, peasants, merchants, knights, and nobles all benefit from your work, their lives defined by the wealth you generate. This system didn't just produce goods. It reinforced a worldview where inequality was natural, even divinely ordained. The economic role of slavery cemented social divisions, creating a society where power and privilege rested on the backs of the powerless. Dynamic we'll explore in the next section. Imagine standing in a dusty medieval marketplace, the air thick with the shouts of merchants and the clinking of coins. You are not here to buy or sell, you are the commodity. Iron chains bind your wrists, and a crowd watches as an auctioneer extols your virtues, your strength, your youth, your ability to toil endlessly. A wealthy landowner steps forward, his eyes appraising you like a piece of livestock. He hands over a pouch of silver, and with that, you're his. This is no nightmare. It's your reality as a slave in medieval Europe, where the law declares you property, not a person. In this section, we'll delve into the legal framework that upheld slavery, stripping you of rights, dignity, and humanity, and explore how these laws shaped your existence from birth to potential freedom. A legal definition: chattel, not human. In the eyes of medieval law, you weren't a person, you were chattel, a movable piece of property akin to a plow or a cow. This legal status was the cornerstone of slavery, reducing you to an object that could be bought, sold, or inherited. Across Western Europe, from the fall of Rome in the 5th century to the High Middle Ages around the 13th, this definition held firm. Legal codes, like the Visigothic Code in Spain and southern France, explicitly classified slaves as things owned wholly by their masters. The Salic law, used among the Franks, reinforced this by setting fines for stealing or damaging a slave, fines paid to the owner, not to you or your kin. Under this system, you had no legal identity, no voice, and no protection beyond your value to your owner. Pathways to bondage. How did you become a slave? The law provided several grim routes: captives of war. If you were seized in battle, perhaps a Viking raid or a clash between rival kingdoms, you could be legally enslaved. Non-Christians like pagans or Muslims were especially vulnerable, with laws sanctioning their bondage as a spoil of conquest. Debt slavery. Falling into debt could mean losing your freedom. If you couldn't repay a loan, the law might allow your creditor to claim you as a slave, your labor a perpetual payment for an ever-growing sum. Punishment. Commit a crime like theft or rebellion, and the law could sentence you to slavery, turning punishment into profit for the state or a private owner. Born into chains. If your mother was a slave, so were you. The law ensured slavery passed down through generations, a hereditary curse with no escape. These mechanisms were codified and enforced, ensuring a steady supply of slaves. Entire villages might be enslaved after a lost war, or a single family doomed by a father's unpaid debt. Once the law branded you a slave, breaking free was a near impossible feat. Rights erased. As a slave, the law stripped you of even the most basic rights. You couldn't own a scrap of land, a coin, or even the clothes on your back. Everything belonged to your master. Contracts were beyond your reach, and your testimony in court was worthless. Marriage. If your owner permitted it, it held no legal weight. Your spouse and children could be torn from you and sold at a whim. Your body wasn't yours. Your owner could mark it, break it, or end it without facing serious consequences. Some laws hinted at limits. The Visigothic Code, for instance, suggested penalties for excessive cruelty, but these were vague and rarely applied. If your owner killed you, they might owe compensation, not for your life, but for their lost property. The Church, a moral authority, offered mixed messages. It taught that all souls were equal before God, yet upheld slavery as a fact of life. Some priests owned slaves, while others urged kindness, but neither stance granted you legal rights. Treatment. Cruelty sanctioned. The law cared little for how you were treated, prioritizing your owner's rights over your survival. Beating, starvation, and mutilation were common, and you had no recourse. Legal codes might mention fines for killing a slave, say half the penalty for killing a free peasant, but enforcement was lax. Your owner's power was near absolute, restrained only by their desire to keep you productive. In practice, the law turned a blind eye to your suffering, viewing you as a tool to be used, not a person to be protected. Occasionally, the Church stepped in, urging masters to spare the rod as an act of Christian mercy. Yet this was guidance, not law, and it did little to shield you from daily brutality. Your existence was one of endurance, governed by a legal system that saw your pain as irrelevant. Manumission, a distant hope. Freedom was possible, but only through manumission, a legal act entirely dependent on your owner's will. They might free you for loyal service as a deathbed gesture or in a rare burst of generosity. In some cases, you could buy your freedom scraping together coins from extra work if your owner allowed it. The Church encouraged manumission as a pious deed, and some slaves were freed in religious ceremonies, their chains symbolically broken. But this was no right. It was a privilege, and even freedom came with strings. As a freed slave, you might owe your former owner loyalty or labor, your liberty a fragile gift the law could retract. For most, manumission remained a tantalizing mirage, glimpsed but rarely grasped. Slaves and serfs, a shifting line. By the high Middle Ages, slavery was waning, giving way to serfdom. Unlike you, a serf wasn't property. They were bound to the land, not a person. The law granted serfs small rights. They could marry with permission, work a plot for themselves, and keep their families intact. You as a slave had none of these. Serfs were still oppressed, but they existed within a legal framework that recognized their humanity, however faintly. This shift wasn't sudden. Economic pressures, the Church's unease with slavery, and the rise of feudalism nudged society toward serfdom. Yet for you caught in slavery's grip, this change was a distant rumor, offering no relief as the law continued to bind you. A lasting echo. The legal status of slaves in medieval Europe was a machine of dehumanization, grinding away your rights and reducing you to a shadow of a person. These laws defining you as property trapping you in bondage and leaving you defenseless, wove slavery into the fabric of society. They upheld a world where your worth was measured in silver, not in spirit. This legal framework didn't just confine you, it rippled outward, shaping medieval life beyond the slave quarters. It bolstered economies reliant on forced labor and entrenched social hierarchies that prized power over compassion. In the next section, we'll explore how these laws reverberated through society, influencing everything from village life to the grand manners of the elite, and revealing the true cost of a system built on human suffering. Imagine standing in a bustling medieval marketplace, the air thick with the smells of livestock, sweat, and desperation. You're not here to buy or sell goods, you're the merchandise. Your wrists are bound, and a crowd of onlookers gawks as the auctioneer extols your virtues. Strong back, young can work the fields from dawn to dusk. A wealthy landowner steps forward, his eyes appraising you like a horse at market. He nods hands over a pouch of coins, and just like that, you're his property. This isn't a nightmare. It's your reality as a slave in medieval Europe, where the law sees you not as a person, but as chattel, a thing to be owned, used, and discarded. In this section, we'll dive into the harsh legal framework that governed slavery in medieval Europe, stripping slaves of their rights, dignity, and humanity. From the moment you were enslaved, whether through war debt or birth, you were thrust into a system that denied your very personhood. Well, explore how these laws defined you as property, erased your rights, and left you at the mercy of your master's whims. But we'll also uncover the faint glimmers of legal protections, the rare paths to freedom, and how your status compared to other unfree laborers like serfs. By the end, you'll see how these laws not only shaped your daily life, but also upheld the brutal hierarchy of medieval society. A legal definition: chattel not human. In medieval Europe, the law was clear. You as a slave were not a person. You were chattel. This term, rooted in the Latin capital meaning property, defined you as a movable asset, no different from a plow, a cart, or a cow. Legal codes across Europe, from the Visigothic code in Spain to the Salic law among the Franks, enshrined this brutal reality. The Visigothic code, for instance, explicitly stated that slaves were things owned entirely by their masters with no legal identity of their own. Under these laws, you couldn't own property, sign a contract, or even testify in court. Your word was worthless because you were not a person in the eyes of the law. This dehumanizing status was the foundation of slavery, ensuring that you existed solely to serve your master's needs. Your value was measured in coins, not in your humanity, and the law protected your owner's investment, not your life. Pathways to bondage. How did you end up in this wretched state? The law provided several grim avenues. Captives of war. If you were seized in battle, perhaps during a Viking raid or a clash between rival kingdoms, you could be legally enslaved. Non-Christians like pagans or Muslims were especially vulnerable, with laws sanctioning their bondage as a spoil of conquest. The Salic law even set specific fines for stealing a slave, treating you as stolen property rather than a kidnapped person. Debt slavery. Falling into debt was a slippery slope into bondage. If you couldn't repay a loan, the law might allow your creditor to claim you as a slave, your labor a perpetual payment for an ever-growing sum. In some regions, entire families could be enslaved for a single debt. Punishment for crimes. Commit a crime like theft or rebellion, and the law could sentence you to slavery, turning punishment into profit for the state or a private owner. This was a convenient way to fill labor shortages while maintaining social order. Born into chains. If your mother was a slave, so were you. The law of partus sequitur ventrum. The child follows the womb ensured that slavery was hereditary, a curse passed down through generations. Even if your father was free, your mother's status sealed your fate. These legal mechanisms created a steady supply of slaves, ensuring that the system remained robust. Entire villages might be enslaved after a lost war or a single family doomed by a father's unpaid debt. Once the law branded you a slave, escaping this status was nearly impossible. Rights erased. As a slave, the law stripped you of even the most basic human rights. You couldn't own a scrap of land, a coin, or even the tattered clothes on your back. Everything belonged to your master. Contracts were beyond your reach. You couldn't borrow money trade goods or make any legal agreements. Your testimony in court was worthless after. All how could property speak? Marriage was a cruel joke. If your owner allowed you to take a spouse, it held no legal weight. Your children were born into bondage and your family could be torn apart and sold at any moment. Your body wasn't even your own. Your master had the legal right to punish you as he saw fit. Beatings, brandings, or worse were common, and the law rarely intervened. In some regions, killing a slave was treated as property damage, not murder. The Visigothic Code set a fine for killing another man's slave, but it was a pittance compared to the penalty for killing a free person. Your life was cheap, and the law reflected that. Glimmers of protection. Were there any legal protections for slaves? The answer is a faint flickering yes. The church, wielding immense influence, urged masters to treat their slaves with Christian mercy. Sermons and religious texts encouraged owners to avoid excessive cruelty and to remember that slaves too had souls. Some legal codes, like the Visigothic Code, included vague provisions against unjust treatment, but these were rarely enforced. The church also promoted manumission, the freeing of slaves, as a pious act, especially on holy days or in wills. However, these were moral guidelines, not binding laws, and they did little to shield you from daily brutality. In practice, the law cared more about preserving your owner's property than protecting your well-being. If your master beat you too severely, it was seen as his loss. A damaged tool couldn't work as efficiently. But the law wouldn't step in to save you. It would only ensure your owner didn't waste his investment. Manumission, a distant hope. Freedom was possible, but only through manumission, a legal act entirely dependent on your owner's will. Your master might free you as a reward for loyal service, as a deathbed gesture, or in a rare burst of generosity. In some cases, you could buy your freedom, but this required your owner's permission to earn money on the side, a privilege few slaves enjoyed. The church encouraged manumission, and some slaves were freed in religious ceremonies, their chains symbolically broken before the altar. But even freedom came with strings. As a freed slave, you often owed your former owner loyalty or labor, and your liberty could be revoked if you failed to meet these obligations. Moreover, freed slaves faced social stigma and legal disabilities, barred from certain professions or public offices. For most slaves, manumission remained a tantalizing mirage, glimpsed, but rarely grasped. Slaves and serfs, a blurred line. By the High Middle Ages, slavery was slowly giving way to serfdom, a system where laborers were tied to the land rather than owned outright. Unlike you, a serf wasn't property. They were bound to the manor, required to work the Lord's fields. But they had some rights. Serfs could marry with permission, work a small plot for themselves, and keep their families intact. They couldn't be sold individually, and their status wasn't hereditary in the same way as slavery. This shift wasn't sudden. Economic pressures, the church's unease with slavery, and the rise of feudalism nudged society toward serfdom. Yet for you caught in slavery's grip, this change was a distant rumor offering no immediate relief. The law still bound you, and the transition to serfdom was gradual, uneven, and incomplete. A legal system of dehumanization. The legal status of slaves in medieval Europe was a brutal machine of dehumanization. It defined you as property, erased your rights, and left you defenseless against cruelty. These laws not only governed your daily life, but also reinforced a social order where power and privilege rested on the backs of the powerless. Yet this legal framework was just one piece of a larger puzzle. In the next section, we'll explore how these laws intersected with the economic realities of slavery, revealing how your labor fueled the medieval economy and enriched those who held your chains. Ill ever come. For now, you endure a silent pillar in a world that refuses to see you. Imagine waking up in a cold, damp hut, the rough straw beneath you prickling your skin. The faint light of dawn seeps through the cracks in the wooden walls, and you know it's time to rise, not because you want to, but because you must. You are a slave in medieval Europe, and your day is not your own. Your master's voice echoes in the distance, calling you to the fields where you will toil until the sun sets your hands blistered and your back aching. This is your life, day in and day out with no hope of change. Now fast forward to the present day. A young woman sits in a dimly lit room, her passport confiscated, forced to work in a factory for endless hours with no pay. She is trapped, her freedom stolen, her humanity denied. Though separated by centuries, both of you share a grim reality: you are enslaved. Yet the nature of your bondage, the laws that govern it, and the world's response to it are worlds apart. In this section, we'll explore the stark contrast between medieval slavery and modern ideas of slavery. We'll uncover how slavery was perceived, the rights, or lack thereof, of slaves, and the societal context that shaped these systems. By comparing these two eras, you'll see how far humanity has come in recognizing the horrors of slavery and how far we still have to go. A tale of two eras. The perceptions of slavery. In medieval Europe, slavery was not just accepted, it was woven into the fabric of society. You were seen as a necessary part of the economy, a tool to be used for labor, whether in the fields, the household, or even in skilled trades. Slaves were often captives from wars, criminals, or those who had fallen into debt. While your life was harsh, it wasn't always devoid of hope. In some regions, you could earn your freedom, be freed by a kind master, or even rise to positions of relative power. For instance, in Viking societies, slaves, known as thralls, could sometimes buy their freedom or be granted it after years of service. In the Byzantine Empire, slaves could hold administrative roles, wielding influence despite their status. Contrast this with modern slavery, where the very idea is universally condemned. Today, slavery is illegal in every country, a violation of fundamental human rights. The United Nations and countless organizations work tirelessly to eradicate it, and international laws like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights explicitly prohibit slavery in all its forms. Yet despite this global consensus, slavery persists, hidden, insidious, and evolving. Modern slavery includes human trafficking, forced labor, debt bondage, and child exploitation. Unlike in medieval times where slavery was often visible and accepted today's, Slavery is clandestine thriving in the shadows of illegal markets and corrupt systems. The key difference: in medieval Europe, slavery was a legal, visible institution. Today, it is a crime, yet it endures often unseen and unacknowledged. Rights and legal status, from property to personhood. As a medieval slave, your legal status was clear: you were property. Laws across Europe, from the Visigothic Code to the Salic Law, defined you as chattel, a movable asset with no inherent rights. You couldn't own land sign contracts or testify in court. Your master could sell you, punish you, or even kill you with little consequence. Yet paradoxically, some medieval legal systems offered you a sliver of protection. In England, for example, the laws of Eni, circa 694 AD, set penalties for masters who killed their slaves without cause. In some regions, you could marry, own small possessions, or even sue for your freedom if your master reneged on a promise of manumission. Fast forward to the modern era, and the legal landscape is entirely different. Slavery is outlawed worldwide, and victims of modern slavery are recognized as human beings with full legal rights. International treaties like the 1926 Slavery Convention and the 1956 Supplementary Convention on the Abolition of Slavery aim to eradicate slavery in all its forms. Victims of human trafficking, for instance, are entitled to protection, restitution, and support under laws like the U.S. Trafficking Victims Protection Act. However, the reality is grim. Many victims remain trapped, their rights ignored, their voices silenced by fear, coercion, or corruption. The contrast is stark. In medieval times, you were legally property with limited, inconsistent protections. Today, you are legally a person, but the enforcement of those rights is often woefully inadequate. Societal context: from acceptance to abolition. Medieval society didn't just tolerate slavery, it relied on it. Your labor powered the economy, from agriculture to craftsmanship. In a world where land and lineage defined power, slaves were a crucial asset for the elite. The church, too, played a complex role. While it preached spiritual equality, it often owned slaves and justified the institution through scripture. Slavery was seen as a natural part of the social order, a consequence of war, sin, or misfortune. Yet even in this rigid hierarchy, there were moments of humanity. Some slaves were treated as part of the household, and manumission was not unheard of, especially as a reward for loyalty or service. In contrast, modern society views slavery as an abomination. The abolitionist movements of the 18th and 19th centuries, fueled by Enlightenment ideals and moral outrage, led to the global prohibition of slavery. Today, slavery is not just illegal, it's morally repugnant. Governments, NGOs, and activists work to rescue victims, prosecute traffickers, and raise awareness. Yet despite these efforts, modern slavery persists, exploiting the vulnerable in a world that claims to value freedom and equality. The societal context has shifted from acceptance to condemnation, but the battle is far from over. Economic realities: visible labor versus hidden exploitation. In medieval Europe, your labor was visible and vital. You worked the fields, tended livestock, or served in households, your efforts directly contributing to your master's wealth. Slavery was an open part of the economy, with slaves bought and sold in markets, their value fluctuating like any commodity. The system was brutal, but straightforward. Your labor was extracted through force, and your master reaped the rewards. Today, modern slavery is often hidden, its economic impact harder to trace. Victims might work in sweatshops, on fishing boats, or in brothels their labor fueling illicit industries. The International Labor Organization estimates that modern slavery generates 150 billion in illegal profits annually, yet this wealth is siphoned into the shadows, enriching criminals rather than legitimate economies. Unlike medieval slavery, which was a recognized institution, modern slavery operates in the dark, making it harder to combat. The economic contrast is clear. Medieval slavery was a visible legal institution that powered the economy, while modern slavery is an illegal hidden scourge that undermines it. A lingering shadow. The evolution of exploitation. Despite the centuries that separate medieval and modern slavery, one grim thread remains the exploitation of the vulnerable. In both eras, those with power, whether feudal lords or human traffickers, have found ways to strip others of their freedom for profit. Yet the world's response has evolved. Where medieval society accepted slavery as a fact of life, modern society condemns it as a crime against humanity. The fight against slavery is now a global mission, but the persistence of modern slavery reminds us that legal abolition is not enough. True freedom requires vigilance enforcement and a commitment to justice. This evolution in how we view and combat slavery is not just a moral victory, it's a testament to humanity's capacity for change. Yet as well see, in the next section, the economic role of slavery, both past and present, reveals the deep roots of exploitation and the challenges we still face in uprooting it. Imagine living in a time when the church's word was law, its influence permeating every aspect of life. As a slave in medieval Europe, you might look to the church for solace, hoping for a message of liberation. Yet the church's stance on slavery was far from straightforward. It was a tapestry of contradictions, woven from threads of scripture, theology, and pragmatism. In this section, we'll unravel this complex relationship, exploring how the church both condemned and condoned slavery, often within the same breath. By the end, you will understand why the church's position was as much a reflection of its time as it was a moral quandary that still echoes today. The church's initial position. In the early days of Christianity, slavery was an accepted institution. The Roman Empire, where Christianity took root, relied heavily on slave labor. The New Testament reflects this reality with passages like Ephesians 6:5-9, instructing slaves to obey their masters and masters to treat their slaves fairly. Yet there are also verses like Galatians 3:28, which proclaim that in Christ there is neither slave nor free, suggesting a spiritual equality that transcended social status. This duality set the stage for the church's complex relationship with slavery. On one hand, the church accepted slavery as part of the social order. On the other, it preached a message of spiritual freedom and equality before God. This tension would persist throughout the medieval period, shaping the church's evolving stance on slavery. Theological justifications. The church theologians grappled with the morality of slavery, often arriving at conflicting conclusions. Augustine of Hippo, one of the most influential church fathers, argued that slavery was a consequence of sin. In his view, the fall of man introduced inequality and servitude into the world, making slavery a regrettable but necessary part of the human condition. This perspective allowed the church to accept slavery while still condemning the sins that led to it. However, not all theologians agreed. Gregory of Nyssa, a 4th century bishop, delivered a scathing critique of slavery, calling it an affront to God's creation. He argued that no human being should own another, as all are made in God's image. Despite such voices, The church as an institution often leaned towards Augustine's more pragmatic view, using it to justify the continuation of slavery. The concept of spiritual freedom became a key theological tool. The church taught that while physical bondage might be a reality, true freedom came through faith in Christ. This allowed the church to sidestep the issue of physical slavery, focusing instead on the salvation of souls. For slaves, this message was both a comfort and a frustration, promising eternal freedom, while offering little hope for earthly liberation. Practical involvement. The church's relationship with slavery wasn't just theoretical, it was deeply practical. Monasteries, bishoprics, and even the papacy owned slaves, using them for labor on vast estates. These slaves worked the fields, tended livestock, and performed domestic duties, much like their secular counterparts. The church justified this by arguing that it treated its slaves more humanely than lay owners, often citing the biblical injunction to treat your slaves justly and fairly. Colossians 4:1. Moreover, the church participated in the slave trade, albeit indirectly. Popes and bishops sometimes accepted slaves as gifts or tribute, and some monastic communities engaged in the buying and selling of slaves to meet labor needs. However, the church also encouraged manumission, the freeing of slaves, as an act of charity. Many wills from the period include provisions for freeing slaves, often as a way to atone for the testator's sins. This dual role as both slave owner and advocate for manumission highlights the church's contradictory stance. It sought to balance its moral teachings with the economic realities of the time, often leading to actions that seemed at odds with its spiritual message. Contradictions and debates within the church. There were ongoing debates about the morality of slavery. Some clergy argued passionately for the humane treatment of slaves, citing Christ's teachings on compassion and love. Others saw slavery as a necessary evil, a means of maintaining social order in a fallen world. Still others, like Gregory of Nyssa, called for its abolition, though their voices were often drowned out by more pragmatic concerns. These debates were not merely academic, they had real-world implications. For example, during the Viking raids of the 9th and 10th centuries, many Christians were enslaved by pagan Norsemen. The church condemned this practice, arguing that Christians should not be enslaved by non-Christians. However, this stance was more about protecting the faithful than opposing slavery itself. The church had little to say about the enslavement of non-Christians, which was often seen as a just outcome of war or conquest. The church's position was further complicated by its involvement in the Crusades and the Reconquista. In these conflicts, the enslavement of Muslims and other non-Christians was not only accepted, but encouraged as a way to weaken the enemy and reward Christian warriors. This pragmatic approach to slavery underscored the church's willingness to adapt its moral stance to suit political and military needs. Evolution of stance. By the late medieval period, the church's stance on slavery began to shift. The rise of serfdom, a system where peasants were tied to the land but not owned outright, offered a less harsh alternative to slavery. Serfs had more rights than slaves. They could marry, own property, and even sue their lords in some cases. This system, while still exploitative, was seen as a step towards greater freedom. The church played a role in this transition, encouraging the manumission of slaves and the adoption of serfdom. Popes like Gregory VII and Urban II issued decrees urging Christians to free their slaves, especially those who had converted to Christianity. However, These efforts were piecemeal and often ignored by powerful landowners. Moreover, the church's involvement in the slave trade continued, particularly in the context of the Crusades. The capture and sale of Muslim prisoners became a lucrative business, with the church often turning a blind eye or even profiting from it. This contradiction, preaching freedom while profiting from bondage, would haunt the church for centuries. A legacy of contradiction. The church's stance on slavery in medieval Europe was a study in contradiction. It preached spiritual equality while owning slaves, condemned the enslavement of Christians while sanctioning the bondage of others, and encouraged manumission while profiting from the slave trade. These inconsistencies reflect the church's struggle to reconcile its moral teachings with the realities of a world built on unfree labor. Yet despite these contradictions, the church's evolving stance laid the groundwork for future abolitionist movements. Its teachings on the dignity of all people, however inconsistently applied, planted seeds of change that would eventually bear fruit. As we turn to the next section, we'll explore how slaves themselves resisted their bondage, drawing on both spiritual and practical means to assert their humanity in a world that denied it. Their actions, often inspired by the very faith that sometimes failed them, reveal a resilience that challenged the church's ambivalence and forced society to confront the humanity of the enslaved. In the grim landscape of medieval Europe, where slavery cast a long and oppressive shadow, there were whispers of defiance, stories of slaves who refused to let their spirits be broken. These men and women, bound by chains and stripped of their freedom, fought back against their masters with astonishing courage. Their resistance took many forms, from quiet acts of sabotage to daring escapes and even violent uprisings. Each act was a gamble, a roll of the dice, where the stakes were life itself, freedom on one side, torture or death on the other. Yet for these slaves, the flicker of hope was worth every risk. In this section, we'll uncover their stories, tales of resilience that not only challenged the brutal institution of slavery, but also lit the way toward its eventual unraveling. Individual acts of resistance. For many slaves, resistance was a personal battle fought in the shadows of their daily toil. Running away was the most daring and common act of defiance. Slaves would wait for the right moment, a stormy night, a distracted overseer, then slip into the darkness, hearts pounding as they fled toward an uncertain future. The odds were stacked against them. Recapture meant savage beatings or worse, and survival depended on wit and luck. Yet the dream of freedom drove them onward. Consider the tale of Edric, a slave in 10th century Anglo-Saxon England. Owned by a merciless lord, Edric suffered years of cruelty, his body scarred, his rations meager. One fateful night, as thunder masked his footsteps, he bolted into the forest. For days he dodged search parties, scavenging berries and hiding in thickets. Exhausted and near starvation, he reached a small monastery. There, he threw himself at the mercy of the abbot, pleading for sanctuary with a voice hoarse from desperation. Moved by Edric's faith and plight, the abbot sheltered him, defying the Lord's wrath. Eventually, Edric gained his freedom, a rare victory secured by the church's compassion. His story, though exceptional, echoes the quiet heroism of countless others who risked all to escape. Not all resistance was so dramatic. Some slaves fought back with cunning subtlety, sabotaging tools, feigning illness, or working at a snail's pace. A plow might mysteriously break in the field, costing the master a day's labor, A kitchen slave might forget to stoke the fire serving cold gruel to an irate household. These acts, though small, were a lifeline, a way to reclaim a shred of dignity in a world bent on crushing it. Over time, they wore down their oppressors, proving that even the powerless could strike back. Collective acts of resistance. When slaves banded together, their resistance shook the foundations of medieval society. Collective uprisings were rare, explosive, and terrifying to the ruling class. These rebellions often sprang from shared misery, hunger, brutality, and the yearning for liberation. Though few succeeded, they left an indelible mark, exposing the fragility of a system built on subjugation. One striking example is the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England. While primarily a rebellion of serfs and peasants against crushing taxes and labor demands, it included slaves among its ranks and free laborers, desperate to cast off their chains. Led by Wat Tyler, the rebels stormed London, torching manor houses and freeing captives from dungeons. Their demands were radical: an end to bondage and a fairer world. For a fleeting moment, they held power only to be crushed by royal forces. Yet the revolt's echoes lingered, a warning to the elite that the downtrodden could rise as one. Across the continent in the Byzantine Empire, smaller revolts flared. In the 9th century, a band of slaves and discontented soldiers rallied against imperial rule, their uprising a chaotic bid for freedom. Though swiftly quelled, it revealed the simmering unrest beneath the empire's grandeur. Such collective acts, though scattered, were a testament to the power of unity even among those deemed powerless. The risks and consequences resistance came at a harrowing cost. Slaves who dared to defy their masters faced a gauntlet of punishments designed to break body and soul. A runaway caught in the act might be flogged until their back was a lattice of scars or branded with a hot iron as a permanent mark of shame. Rebels faced even grimmer fate's torture, mutilation, or execution, their bodies displayed as a macabre lesson to others. The law was unrelenting. Slaves were property, and rebellion was an affront to order itself. The brutality was meant to deter, but it often fueled further defiance. For every slave dragged back in chains, another watched and waited, plotting their own stand. The risks were clear, yet the human spirit proved stubbornly resilient. Each act of resistance, however doomed, was a cry against dehumanization, a refusal to be reduced to mere chattel. The impact of resistance. Though individual escapes and uprisings rarely toppled slavery outright, their ripples spread far. Every story of defiance, whispered in taverns, sung in fields, or preached from pulpits, chipped away at the myth of slavery's invincibility. These acts sowed doubt among masters and hope among the enslaved, fostering a slow but growing belief that change was possible. Resistance wasn't just survival. It was a spark igniting a broader struggle for justice. In the monasteries and villages, tales like Edric's inspired quiet acts of mercy, priests offering sanctuary, peasants hiding runaways. On a larger scale, revolts like 1381 forced rulers to reckon with the discontent brewing beneath their thrones. Over centuries, these moments of bravery helped shift the tide, proving that slavery was not an eternal truth, but a system that could be undone. Transition to the decline of slavery. As we turn to the next section, the decline of slavery in medieval Europe comes into view, a process shaped not just by kings and bishops, but by the slaves themselves. Their resistance from Edric's flight to the fiery march of the Peasants' Revolt laid bare the cracks in the institution. Economic changes, religious debates, and social upheavals would widen those cracks, but it was the slaves' unyielding fight for freedom that first weakened the chains. Their stories, etched in blood and hope, remind us that the end of slavery was no gift from above. It was a victory wrested from below, one defiant step at a time. In the early Middle Ages, slavery was a grim reality woven into the fabric of European society. Imagine being torn from your home, in a raid shackled, and forced to toil endlessly in a foreign land. Your life reduced to the whims of a lord who owned you outright. Slaves were the backbone of the economy, working fields, tending livestock, and serving households. Yet over time, this brutal institution began to fade. The decline of slavery in medieval Europe was not a sudden uprising or a single decree, but a gradual unraveling driven by economic shifts and social transformations. Between the 11th and 14th centuries, these changes reshaped the continent, loosening the chains of bondage and setting the stage for new forms of labor and life. Let's explore how this happened. Slavery in the early Middle Ages. To understand the decline, we first need to grasp how widespread slavery once was. After the Roman Empire's fall, Europe fragmented into a patchwork of warring kingdoms and local fiefdoms. Slaves, often captives from conflicts, debtors, or those born into servitude, were a vital labor force. In Anglo-Saxon England, for instance, the Domesday Book of 1086 recorded that about 1 in 10 people were slaves. In Scandinavia, thralls were so essential that their roles and punishments were detailed in legal codes. This was a world where human beings were property traded like livestock and worked to exhaustion. But by the late Middle Ages, this system was crumbling. What changed? Economic changes, a new way of working. The economy of medieval Europe began to shift in ways that made slavery less practical and profitable. One key change was the rise of the manorial system. This agricultural framework organized land into estates managed by lords worked by peasants tied to the soil serfs. Unlike slaves, serfs weren't owned outright. They owed labor and a share of their crops to the lord, but kept some produce for themselves. This gave them a stake in their work, boosting productivity without the constant oversight slaves required. Lords found serfdom cheaper and more flexible than maintaining slave populations who needed feeding and housing year-round, even when work was scarce. Another economic shift was the growth of towns and trade. Starting in the 11th century, urban centers like London, Paris, and Florence began to thrive. These towns needed skilled workers, craftsmen, traders, and laborers, not bound slaves. A legal custom emerged if an escaped slave lived in a town for a year, and a day they could claim freedom. This drew many to urban life, shrinking the rural slave pool. Meanwhile, innovations like the heavy plow and three-field crop rotation made farming more efficient, reducing the need for large labor forces. Slavery, once the engine of the economy, was losing its edge. Social changes, faith and freedom. While economic forces weakened slavery, social changes struck at its moral and legal foundations. Christianity, the dominant force in medieval Europe, played a pivotal role, though its influence was complex. The Church taught that all souls were equal before God, a message that clashed with human bondage. While it didn't ban slavery outright, it encouraged freeing slaves as an act of piety, especially if they converted. Bishops and nobles sometimes freed slaves in their wills, and over time enslaving fellow Christians became frowned upon. This shift was slow and uneven, but it planted seeds of doubt about slavery's legitimacy. Legal systems also evolved. As kingdoms like England and France centralized power, they developed codes that emphasized rights and obligations over outright ownership of people. In England, After the Norman conquest of 1066, slavery faded from legal records. By the 12th century, replaced by serfdom. Serfs had more protections. They couldn't be sold apart from the land and could appeal to courts in some cases. This was a far cry from the absolute control lords once had over slaves. Cultural attitudes shifted too. The High Middle Ages saw the rise of ideals like chivalry, which prized honor and dignity. Owning humans began to feel out of step with these values. By the 13th century, slavery was rare in much of Western Europe, though it lingered in places like Spain and Scandinavia, where old ways died harder. Regional examples: a patchwork decline. The decline of slavery varied across Europe. In England, it was largely gone by the 1100s, replaced by serfdom under Norman rule. In France, the process stretched into the 14th century, with pockets of slavery persisting longer. Scandinavia held on to thralls into the 13th century, fueled by Viking traditions. But even there, the practice waned as trade and Christianity took hold. In Aragon, Spain, King Alfonso III freed Muslim slaves in 1118, blending religious zeal with political strategy. These regional differences show that slavery's end was no single event, but a mosaic of local changes. The role of the enslaved. We can't overlook the enslaved themselves. Their resistance, fleeing to towns seeking sanctuary in churches, or rarely rebelling outright, pushed back against the system. Take the story of an English slave named Edric, who escaped his master and found refuge in a monastery. Such acts, though small, rippled through society, forcing lords to reckon with the human cost of slavery. Over time, this quiet defiance paired with broader shifts made the old ways unsustainable. Looking ahead, why you can't try it for a day. The decline of slavery in medieval Europe wasn't just an economic or social shift, it was a profound transformation of how people lived and worked. Serfdom and wage labor rose from its ashes, each with its own burdens, but they offered more autonomy than slavery ever did. This slow fade wasn't inevitable. It was forged by necessity, faith, and the stubborn will of those who refused to be property. So why can't you just try being a medieval slave for a day? In the next section, we'll dive into the raw, unfiltered reality of that life and why its echoes still shape our world today. You wake before dawn, the cold seeping through the thin straw that serves as your bed. Your muscles ache from yesterday's unrelenting labor, but rest is a luxury you can't afford. The sharp crack of the overseer's whip echoes in the distance, a grim signal that your day has begun. You stumble outside the frigid air, biting at your skin, and join the other slaves trudging toward the fields. The work is grueling, plowing heavy soil, sowing seeds, or harvesting crops under a merciless sun. Your hands blister and bleed, but you can't pause. To stop is to invite punishment, and punishment here is swift and brutal. By midday, hunger gnaws at your empty stomach, dulled only by a meager ration of stale bread and water. As the sun dips below the horizon, you drag yourself back to the hut, your body spent, your mind too weary to dream. Tomorrow, it all begins again. This might sound like a vivid snapshot of a medieval slave's day, but it's barely a shadow of the full truth. You can't try being a medieval slave for a day, because slavery wasn't just a collection of harsh moments. It was a lifelong sentence that ground down your body, mind, and soul over years. The physical toil was punishing, yes, but the real weight came from knowing there was no end, no reprieve, no hope of anything better. A single day might mimic the exhaustion, but it can't touch the despair of a life with no escape. The permanence of enslavement. Medieval slavery was defined by its unrelenting permanence. Slaves were property owned outright by their masters, stripped of legal rights or protections. In many regions, this status was hereditary. Children born to slaves were doomed to the same chains their fate sealed before they even opened their eyes. Laws reinforced this dehumanization. In Anglo-Saxon England, for instance, slaves were catalogued alongside cattle, and plows their worth tallied in coins rather than their humanity. Physical marks brands seared into skin or ears cropped served as permanent badges of their status, ensuring that even a glance marked them as less than human. A day of trying slavery might let you feel the sting of a whip or the ache of endless labor, but it couldn't replicate the crushing realization that this was your entire existence. You had no autonomy, no future to shape. Your family could be ripped apart at a master's whim, sold to distant lands with no chance of reunion. Your children, if you were permitted to have them, would inherit your shackles. There was no horizon of freedom, no countdown to liberation. For most slaves, death was the only release, a release that a single day could never convey. The psychological toll. Beyond the physical slavery's true brutality lay in its psychological toll. It wasn't just the daily tasks that broke you, it was the systematic erasure of your identity. Every aspect of your life was dictated by someone else, from when you woke to what you ate to whether you lived or died. Resistance was rare and risky. A failed escape could mean flogging, mutilation, or execution. Even if you succeeded in fleeing, medieval society offered few refugees. Villages were small strangers suspect, and a runaway slave was a marked target, hunted down with nowhere to hide. Imagine waking each morning to the same relentless truth: nothing will change. Your suffering isn't a test to endure or a phase to outlast, it's your forever. That slow, grinding erosion of hope and selfhood is what defines slavery, and it's something a day-long experiment can't touch. A day might leave you tired and sore, but it wouldn't strip away your sense of who you are or bury your dreams under decades of despair. A system, not a moment. Slavery wasn't just the cruelty of individual masters, it was a system woven into the fabric of medieval life. The economy depended on it, from the fields that fed the population to the households that ran on unpaid labor. The church, despite its moral claims, often sanctioned or ignored it, sometimes owning slaves itself. Laws were crafted to keep slaves powerless, denied property marriage, or a voice in court. They were trapped in a web of dependence and control. You can't try this for a day, because a day doesn't recreate the suffocating weight of that system. It's not just about enduring a beating or hauling a load, it's about living in a world where every structure, from religion to commerce, conspires to keep you down. A day might scratch the surface of the hardship, but it can mirror the way that system wore away at your humanity over a lifetime. The impossibility of unlearning freedom. Perhaps the deepest reason you can try medieval slavery lies in what it demands: unlearning freedom. Today, we assume a baseline of choice where we go, who we love, how we spend our days. Slavery obliterated that. You didn't plan for tomorrow or dream of better times. Your life belonged to someone else. A day of playing slave might mimic the tasks, but it can't undo the ingrained sense of agency you carry. You'd know it was temporary, a game to walk away from. For a real slave, there was no walking away, only enduring until the end. Linking to the legacy. The scars of medieval slavery didn't vanish when the practice faded. Its lifelong impact, its power to dehumanize across generations left echoes that ripple into our present. Understanding this history isn't just an exercise in looking back. It's a lens for seeing the inequalities that still linger today. In the next section, we'll explore how those echoes persist, challenging us to confront the enduring fight for true freedom. In the shadowed corners of medieval Europe, slavery was not an aberration, but a foundation. From the windswept fields of Anglo-Saxon England to the bustling markets of the Mediterranean, millions lived lives defined by bondage. Their stories of toil, resistance, and survival did not vanish with the turn of centuries. Instead, they wove themselves into the tapestry of our modern world, shaping how we perceive freedom, human rights, and justice. This section explores the lasting legacy of medieval slavery, revealing how its echoes still resonate in our laws, economies, and social structures, urging us to confront both the past and its persistent shadows. A mosaic of medieval bondage. Medieval slavery was not a monolith, but a patchwork of exploitation. Chattel slavery saw individuals owned outright their bodies, and futures traded like livestock. Debt bondage ensnared the desperate, chaining them to unpayable obligations. Serfdom, perhaps the most widespread, bound peasants to the land, their lives tethered to the whims of lords. Though these systems differed, their essence was identical: the stripping away of autonomy, reducing humans to tools of labor. The impact was profound. Slaves and serfs fueled medieval economies, harvesting crops, forging tools, and building the castles that still dot Europe's landscape. Yet their subjugation also entrenched a worldview that ranked people by birth and utility. This hierarchy didn't dissolve with the Middle Ages. It evolved, laying roots for later injustices like the transatlantic slave trade and colonial exploitation. Today, we see its remnants in systemic inequalities, racial divides, economic disparities, and social barriers that trace their lineage to those ancient chains. Freedom's fragile evolution. What does it mean to be free? In medieval times, freedom was a rarity, a privilege hoarded by the elite. For the enslaved, it was a distant dream, glimpsed in fleeting acts of defiance. Take the tale of Balthild, a 7th century slave who rose to become a Frankish queen and worked to curb slavery's cruelty. Her journey, though exceptional, reflects a broader truth. The concept of freedom we hold dear was born from the struggles of the oppressed. These struggles bore fruit over time. The Magna Carta of 1215, though limited in scope, hinted at broader rights. The Enlightenment later amplified these ideas, and by the 20th century, documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights proclaimed freedom as a universal birthright. Yet this evolution was not inevitable. It was carved out by those who, like Balthild, refused to accept bondage as their fate. Today, our laws and ideals stand as testaments to their resilience, but also as reminders of how fragile freedom remains when unchallenged. Human rights, echoes of injustice. The notion of human rights, every person's inherent dignity, would have been alien to much of medieval society. The Church preached equality before God, but often sanctioned earthly bondage. Secular laws codified slavery, treating it as natural as the seasons. Yet from this dissonance sprang early stirrings of justice, faint voices that grew louder across centuries. That growth, however, remains incomplete. Modern slavery, human trafficking, forced labor, child exploitation thrives in the cracks of our globalized world. The International Labor Organization reports that over 40 million people are enslaved today, their plights hidden in sweatshops, brothels, and fields. This persistence mirrors medieval patterns, the powerful profiting from the powerless. Our human rights frameworks, though, robust on paper, falter in practice, revealing how deeply slavery's legacy is embedded in our societies. Economic foundations built on backs. Medieval slavery was an economic powerhouse. Slaves and serfs were the backbone of agriculture, mining, and trade, their unpaid labor, generating wealth that propped up kingdoms. When slavery waned, its spirit lingered in serfdom, then indentured servitude, and later colonial systems. Each iteration refined the art of exploitation, prioritizing profit over humanity. Look at today's world. The global economy still bears these marks. Wealth disparities between nations often align with histories of exploitation. Former slaveholding powers thrive, while once colonized regions struggle. Within societies, low-wage workers in precarious jobs echo the serfs of old, their labor undervalued yet essential. The gig economy, with its promise of flexibility, often delivers instability, instead a modern twist on medieval bondage. This economic thread ties us to the past, challenging us to rethink how we measure progress. Stories that stir the soul. History is not just facts, it's people. Consider the Viking thralls, slaves, who toiled in Scandinavia's harsh landscapes. Some, like those who joined the 11th century uprising in Denmark, fought back their rebellions, sparking whispers of change. Or picture the serfs of 14th century England, whose peasants' revolt shook the feudal order, demanding rights their ancestors could scarcely imagine. These stories humanize the statistics, showing us that resistance, however small, planted seeds for the freedoms we now take for granted. These echoes reach into today. The fight against human trafficking draws inspiration from those medieval rebels as activists work to free the enslaved and heal their wounds. Each victory, every child rescued, every exploiter brought to justice, honors those who defied their chains centuries ago. A legacy we cannot ignore. The legacy of medieval slavery is not a relic to be studied and shelved, it's a living force. It challenges us to see the inequalities around us, not as accidents, but as inheritances. It asks us to act to support fair trade, to advocate for the marginalized, to dismantle systems that profit from suffering. The past teaches us that change is possible, but only if we confront it head on. Bridging to the present. As we reflect on this legacy, the story doesn't end here. The next section will dive into the modern implications, show medieval slavery's tendrils stretch into human trafficking, economic bondage, and the ongoing battle for justice. By tracing these threads, we'll uncover not just the persistence of the past, but the tools we need to build a future where freedom and dignity are truly universal. As we draw the curtains on this journey through the shadows of medieval slavery, let us pause to breathe in the stillness of reflection. The echoes of shackles and silent cries have long since faded into the annals of history, yet their resonance lingers softly in the fabric of our modern world. We have wandered through the tangled roots of bondage, tracing the slow, arduous path toward the light of freedom and human dignity. A path carved not by the swift strokes of revolution, but by the quiet, persistent footsteps of countless souls yearning to be seen, to be whole. In the hush of this moment, we see how the legacy of that distant suffering has woven itself into the very threads of our understanding of what it means to be free. It is a legacy that whispers through the laws we craft, the rights we cherish, and the compassion we strive to nurture. Yet it also reminds us, with a gentle but insistent murmur, that the work is not done, that the shadows of exploitation still stretch across the globe, cloaked in new guises, awaiting the light of our collective resolve. As you settle into the embrace of the night, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a quiet stream, carried by the current of history toward a horizon of hope. For in understanding the weight of the past, we find the strength to shape a future where freedom is not a distant dream, but a shared reality, tender and unbroken. And so, with the stars as our witness, we close this chapter not with finality, but with a promise, a promise to remember to learn and to carry forward the light of human dignity into the dawn of tomorrow.